for inviting me down here today. I often spend time in Anglesea, and it's a great part of the world, part of this side of Melbourne. I love this part of Melbourne. And I really wanted to commend you all for fighting so hard to save this cottage, because the story of this cottage and the connections of this cottage actually go back right to the beginning of Melbourne. When Melbourne was first established, the first ship to come into Melbourne with free passengers, bounty passengers, came in October 1839, and it was called the David Park. Within 2 months, another 3 ships came into Melbourne, all with bounty passengers, 3 settlers, and those 3 ships were chartered by a man by the name of John Marshall. This John Marshall was the brother of Thomas Marshall, who was the first landholder in this area, and after whom, of course, this area is called. So this area is really actually significant to even the development of Melbourne. It's a fantastic story. So Thomas Mulcaster Marshall was born in 1790 in Yorkshire, in a little place called Ferry Fryston. He was the second son of another John Marshall. So in those days, you know, John Marshall called his firstborn John, so it went down. So this John was the older brother, 3 years older than Thomas, and they both John and Thomas married girls who grew up in Hull, and they were daughters of Hull ship owners. They were really quite wealthy men. John married a girl called Betsy Featherston, and Thomas married a girl called Sarah Foster, but she was actually always called Sally Foster. Both Betsy and Sally brought dowries worth £1,000 to their marriages. Now £1,000 in around 1810, 1814, when the 2 boys were married, it's worth about £100,000 today. So that gives you an idea of the wealth of the families. They owned ships. Both Joel Foster and James Featherston had ships that traded in the Baltic, they traded in the Caribbean, Hull was a big whaling port as well, so they were into whaling up around the Arctic. And this John Marshall owned 30 ships in his life, and a couple of them actually came and whaled down in the southern fisheries around Australia, New Zealand and the Pacific. So John and Thomas, the 2 brothers, by 1810 were living in London. They decided they wanted a bigger lot. So they went down to London, and they started off in a small way in a partnership as ship brokers and insurance brokers. And with the help from both their wives' dowries and the assistance of their 2 fathers-in-law, they were able to buy a couple of ships, and they had 6 ships altogether. But their partnership broke up in 1821, and John bought out Thomas's shares in the 4 ships they owned at that time. And in 1821, Thomas's son Thomas was born, and he's the man who Jennifer will be telling you a bit about, because he's also really critical to this story. So in 1821 was a big year for Thomas Mulcaster Marshall, Thomas Senior. His partnership broke up with his brother, and his namesake son was born. At that time, Thomas was living in Bethnal Green. Bethnal Green's in the east end of London, as was John was living in Hackney, because the east end of London there was easy to get down to the Thames, to the river. And so a lot of ship owners lived in the East End. And Thomas decided to try his hand at land development, a very familiar story to us today. And within 4 years, he was bankrupt. He owed over 100 people, couldn't pay his debts, but his debts, now I did write this down, and I didn't do the conversion to today's money, but if we work out that I did do the conversion for the £1,000 dowries were worth nearly £100,000 today. His debts, he had debts to £24,000 and assets including property at Trinidad and Quebec in Canada were just over £21,000. So he's only £3,000 short, but it was enough for him to flee the country, and he went to Belgium. And he became a horse trader, which is also fairly significant for what he was doing when he later came to Geelong area. And so he's living in Belgium, and that's where his fourth and youngest son, called Foster, his wife's maiden name, Foster Marshall, was born in Ostend. So by 1835, his creditors decided they'd chase him up because they were wanting their money. And things were getting a bit hot for Thomas, and he decided that he would try and not pay his debts, basically. So his brother John, by then, was extremely wealthy and extremely well known. In fact, you've probably heard of Lloyd's of London, the big insurance company. Well, Lloyd's had developed the system for classification of ships, working out whether they're seaworthy or not, and they used to publish two registers, one for insurers and one for the ship owners. And John was quite a clever man in systems and that sort of thing, and he said, this is ridiculous having two registers, a red register and a green register, because there are a lot of shipping accidents and things because the underwriters, the insurers and the ship owners were working on different bits of information. So it took him 10 years, but by 1834 he had got agreement from the main Lloyd's Committee to have one book, and it's still published today, and it's called Lloyd's Register of Shipping. And if you do any ship research, you know, that's your book. That's the book you go to find out who owned the ships, where they were sailing, their tonnage, all that sort of thing. So John, by the mid-1830s, had got into immigration. He decided that was what he was going to do. And as I started off by saying, he sent the first 3 of the first 4 ships to come to Melbourne. And in fact, he assisted Thomas and his family, his brother Thomas, who was trying to flee his creditors, to come, and they came on a ship called the Andromache in 1840. And when they were coming through the rip, they had a little bit of trouble, and then when they got up to Williamstown, they actually grounded. And it was a bit of a foretaste of what Thomas Mulcaster Marshall's life was going to be like in Victoria, because his path was a little rocky, to say the least. So he became his brother John's agent, and John had an office in where the Customs House was, and the Customs House, of course, is now the Immigration Museum. Not that building, of course, but that site, because it was near the turning basin for the river. And so that's where John's office was and where Thomas was at first. Now, Thomas decided to get involved in the formation of the Corporation of Melbourne, the first corporation, which was 1842. And he was wanting to address all the citizens of Melbourne, the freeholders, the owners, people who could vote, the men who could vote. And Thomas Arden, owner of one of the newspapers, thought he heard a whisper about Thomas having flown away from his creditors. And so he wrote a few things in his paper, the Port Phillip Patriot, that weren't terribly kind, and stretched the truth. Fortunately for Thomas, stretched the truth a little bit, and so Thomas took him to court, and so it was the first libel action in Melbourne. It was between Thomas Mulcaster Marshall and George Arden, the owner of the Port Phillip Patriot. And Thomas won, luckily, only by a hair's breadth. But then the recession struck, the big major 1841-42 recession in Australia, all of Australia actually, all the East Coast certainly. And Thomas got caught up in that, and he became bankrupt again. But I'll just give you those figures. It was hundreds. It was, I can't know if I can find it quickly enough. Yes, he was one of 237 insolvencies at Port Phillip that year in 1842, and his liabilities were declared at £527, while his assets were 266. I mean, a huge come down. He was dealing in tens of thousands in England, and that he was dealing in hundreds of pounds in Port Phillip. And so with that bankruptcy, he decided things were a bit too hot in Melbourne, and in the 1840s he bought land here and he called his first home Breakwater, and his second home was Woodstock. And I will leave it to Jennifer to tell the rest of his story in this area, because it's really the background to the family and the connections with John that I've researched. So my book on John Marshall, it took 20 years to write because I had to wait till I could go over to England and research the records over there. Oh, one thing I was going to tell you, the bankruptcy file for Thomas in 1825, and the file goes through to about 1839 before he came out here. You know, files about that thick, and it's a really interesting document for telling you the sorts of people he was dealing with and the sons he was dealing with. It's just incredible. So the book was launched last year at the end of February, and then we all know what happened in March. COVID struck. So it's sort of, not a lot of people have heard about it, but I'm hoping they will. So it normally sells for $35, and if you'd like a copy, they're $30 tonight, and I think we bought a few, didn't we? Yeah. We've got a few with us. So that's just very quick overview of the Marshalls and why it is so important to preserve your history. I mean, these stories you are so lucky to have one of the original bluestone cottages in this area. It's extraordinary to have that. And in Australia, we just don't respect our history, our built history, the way we should. Overseas, you would never ever, the road wouldn't even be coming near that property overseas. They'd be going around it. But here, we think, clear the land, you know, knock everything down, she'll be right, mate. Put a few stones in a park and that's a cottage. No, it's not. It's absolutely okay to move cottages like that. Look at Latrobe's cottage. It's been moved 3 times, and actually very little of the remainder of Latrobe's cottage is there, but it's the home of our first governor in Victoria, and it is really, it's a National Trust property now, and valued, thank goodness, due to the work of a few people like this group. So it's absolutely imperative we hold our history, especially our built history, because our kids and our grandchildren won't know anything about it if there's nothing left to see. So that's my